Peace and Black Power, family. This is Shakim Maman Hotep Aket, right back at you once again. Right now, I'm standing out in front of the Old Slave Mart, Charleston, South Carolina. You know, this particular area right here is an African burial ground. You know, in this area, we have had the most slaves imported from the West African coast. And with that being said, Charleston, South Carolina has a lot of history. And whenever we begin to think about our history and our history of rebellion and our history of fight, we all have to bring it back to this particular location. And in the early 19th century, it was a basic open display of the selling and the buying and the auctioning off of slaves. Hence, we have the Slave Mart down here further off on East Bay Street, where we were openly buying and selling and auctioning off slaves. Now, later on at around 1859, 1856, there was a provision that was actually passed that made it illegal for the slave master to actually openly sell slaves in the open. So what happened is that we now had a slave mart, and we had buildings that were erected so that the slaves did not have to be auctioned off in the middle of the street. They actually started to sell and buy and sell slaves in buildings. Now, at this particular location, the slave mart, the Old Slave Mart here, there were actually 4 rooms along this location, or 4 buildings along this location that the slaves were actually lived in or quartered in. We had a jail. It was a 4-story jail. Then you had a kitchen. Then you had a morgue, and then you had the auction gallery. So what happens is that in this area, it was fitting for slaves to be here because you had the runaway slaves that would actually be placed inside of the jail, the kitchen to actually feed them, the auction gallery to actually put the slaves here to on display for the cruel and wicked slave masters. And you also had the morgue when the slaves were rebellious and they didn't want to take the bullshit anymore. So they had the morgue already ready for them. And in the event that they died because of starvation and ill treatment, they already had a morgue accessible. So when you look at this particular location right now, you can imagine the blood that actually soaked the soil, and that is why the spirit of the ancestors is right here and right now, ready for us to just tap into, so that we can now reclaim the African memory bank that we lost for so long. And in this particular location right here, this slave mart, you can almost feel the spirit of rebellion. You can almost feel the spirit of mourning. You can almost feel the spirit of the families being broken and torn apart. You can almost feel the spirit of hate for the enemy. You can almost feel that spirit of love that we had for ourselves, and we stuck together. And at this particular location right now, you can feel or tap into the spirit of the ancestors. And once we realized that at this location, we had the blood shed, we had the visions of freedom, we had the visions of going back home to ancient Africa. We had visions of the motherland. This port of Charleston, South Carolina is going to be the reclamation of our African spirit, and we will begin to tap into that, and we will begin to lead the rebellion. Now, once we begin to actually analyze the history of the location where we're at now, there was a councilman by the name of Thomas Ryan. He was the one that actually envisioned putting up this location or this building. And before it was called the Old Slave Mart, it was called Ryan's Mart, after Thomas Ryan, who was a Charleston city councilman. And it's no wonder why Charleston city councilmen have the mentality that they do now, because they are the ones who are responsible for erecting this edifice of hate. And Thomas Ryan actually put together the blueprint to keep these slaves intact, to keep these slaves shackled. And when you actually go into this museum, you will begin to see all types of slave badges, and you will see all type of leg shackles, and you will begin to see the instruments of abuse that they use to actually savagely whip and abuse our people. Now, in 1859, there was an auction master by the name of Z.B. Oakes who purchased Ryan Mart and actually built what is now this Old Slave Mart, and he used it as an auction gallery. So what happened is that right here at this location, there was a public display. They said that they used to use tables that were around 3 feet high, and they would put the slaves on these little tables 3 feet high, so everybody that you would see that would be walking up and down Chalmers Street would actually be looking at slaves that they would want to buy or potentially buy. That is why the ancestors now are calling us in this particular location to arise and stand. We can't look at these buildings just as a symbol of tourism. This is actually more than a tourist site. This is a site that has a sentimental meaning for our people. And these locations, we should actually come and visit them and meditate outside of them so that we can begin to feel what we need to do in order to liberate ourselves. Imagine how many slaves stood at this same location where I'm at right now and cried. Imagine how many slaves stood at this location and were determined that they would rather die than to be captured and to be put out and work as slaves. Imagine how many slaves actually stood at this location and thought about the future. Us, me and you. Imagine how many slaves stood at this location and wanted to see the people free. So that is why I stand before you today at this location, urging you to tap into your African memory bank. And if we do not tap into our African memory bank, then we will be full of amnesia and we will not begin to understand the nature of who we are. That is why we are now failing as a people, because we are not looking back to these locations and grabbing hold to our legacy of rebellion. We are not tapping into our legacy of determination for freedom and justice and equality. And that is why I'm going to these locations, especially in Charleston, South Carolina, to show you what we need to do to be able to fight against this enemy. I'll be going right up the street to a location that was termed the Hanging Tree. The Hanging Tree was actually storied to be the place where Nat Turner actually was hung because of the slave rebellion that he decided to undertake to see the people free. At that location on Ashley Avenue, the original tree that was storied to be the Hanging Tree is no longer there. However, there was a tree that resembles that old tree that was planted and is there for us to actually see. There was a big debate on whether or not that tree should have been cut down. However, it still stands right now, and we need to utilize it as something that we can have as a monument so that we can see what will happen to us if we ever begin to slip and fall. Right now, I'm gonna leave you with this. A people who have been stripped away from their roots, a people who have been stripped away from their legacy, a people who have been stripped away from that African memory bank, are nothing but slaves who are void of any sort of remembrance of who they are as a people and are doomed for failure. So that is why it is imperative and and it's almost mandatory that we begin to now put in the repository of our African memory bank examples of what we were as far as in Africa when we were kings and queens, and we also have to put into our African repository now the examples of what our ancestors went through, so that we will not fall victim once again to the useless rhetoric of the so-called Negro begging us to integrate in a burning house. Peace and Black Power. Shakim Amin Hotep.